So next, will please let me invite Professor Xunpeng Shi from University Technology of Sydney. He's an expert of energy economics, and also he is now working in Australia, and we know that Australia is very important country with resource and energy, something like that. And also I mentioned that global supply chains has been damaging seriously by the pandemic. So today he will give a talk using the case of Australia and China about the supply chains. So please, Dr. Shi.
Hi, very good afternoon in our Asia Pacific, and good morning for Europe. Thanks for Professor Shi and Professor Yan to give me opportunity to report my ongoing study about the economic and emission impact of supply chain disruptions. I will use Australia-China trade as an example. As Professor Xue in his introduction already mentioned, that the COVID-19 created one issue that is matter for our economics and energy community is the supply chain resilience. This afternoon I conduct a quick Google search, and it come out on the top. Maybe there is some reasons on the top of the result are showing those 4 famous consultant firms. They all have dedicated section on supply chain resilience. So then you can imagine that there probably a lot of demanding on consultant service from this leading company. That's another way to reflect the issue is matter of significant concern by the business sector. And if we look a little bit beyond the business sector and more looking from the political and national security discussions, you will see that a lot of discussions, particularly from the developed country, are talking about over dependence of China and what are the alternatives plan to get to resolve the issue. So fortunately or unfortunately, the supply chain resilience is more or less linked with China. I think it's a lot just because China is the first to discover the COVID-19. Is probably more linked to other political issue. And the fortunate part is that, as Professor mentioned, China is the center of global manufacture because the manufacture is more or less centralized in China. When there was a destructions globally, everybody feel the pain. This is particularly serious for the personal protective facility or equipment, which many people are face in ordinary people are face pressure in their daily life. And because that kind of personal feeling, as well as the overall supply chain challenges. And another unfortunate factor is because the US-China trade or more broadly dispute. So the supply chain factor was resilience issue was bring up in the international community in very serious manner. I think for the Asia Pacific, many countries like Japan, India or have planned to so-called reroute the supply chain from China. Definitely US is a leader, and this quote mentioned they use the quadrilateral security dialogue to facilitate the economics. So it means that the supply chain resilience is no longer economic issue or personal issue. It's actually become security and the national top priority issue in many countries. But I think for economics, for us, for basic economics education, educated people will find that it is quite unfortunate for this kind of political interventions of supply chain, because global supply chain is a kind of result of comparative advantage, which will bring benefit for everybody or every country participant. So that's an overall a gain from the integrated supply chain. I think one of the one of the consequence is exactly the benefit loss to the FTA. So if no FTA, every country go to autarky. Then what are the cost and benefit? So, but even such kind of intervention looks to reduce dependency on vulnerable supply chain. The result actually much more complicated because there is a global supply chain, and 60% of global trade are actually component trade or intermediate. So if you only look at the final products, the result could be much more complicated. Here I cite one of the assessment result about the Trump administration 30% tariff on Chinese PV product, and the conclusion that rather than as it was intended to protect the U.S. Solar PV industry, it actually hurt the industry as well as the energy sector. So I think then there's a urgency to start actually impact for alternative supply chain, because this might be driven the moving opposite to the global trade regimes. There are some existing study, including when actually Professor mentioned his study published in Nature. They are generally talking about the overall aggregate impact of supply chain disruptions due to COVID-19. However, there is no study to specifically measure how each specific supply chains, if there's a disrupted, and what will be the impact economic emission, and what are the possibility of alternative emission, but alternative supply chain, which I haven't produced for the current study. Currently, we just estimate the impact of all the supply chains destructions in the Australia-China trade case. Why we start Australia-China trade? One, apparently, is because where I'm located, but more importantly, because Australia and China is widely known the best mate in terms of trade, because they have almost perfect complementary in terms of economic structure. Australia primarily export resource products to China, which will be processed and manufactured to supply the global community, not just the final product, but the steel and other important material. On the other hand, Australia import a lot of manufactured or finished product from China. So the complementary in both countries make it it's a perfect couples in international trade. And as a result, you also see that Australia-China trade is a dominant Australia's trade structure. 1/3 of Australia export are going to China or going to China in the last year, and 1/4 of Australia import are coming from China. And if you see the lower panel, it will show you that in the past 10 years, the total increase of Australia trade. And in that case, you will see that 60% of the increase are due to trade with China. So it means that China dominant Australia trade structure also in the past growth. If you look at the upper panel, you will also see that the second largest trade partner for Australia is Japan, but in a much smaller volume when compared with China. But as people who are reading news now, you probably see a lot of fractions dispute between Australia and China in terms of trade. And from May, when it started from beef, then it's going to timber, lobster, and in the past weeks, it's all about wines. Coal was also considered as a part of the dispute item. So you see that there are a lot of things happen, and Australia, a lot of discussing Australia say we should actually move away from China and reduce our dependency. And but at what cost? That is the issue we are interested in. We don't have any assumptions that whether we should uphold or not, or we should protect every trade. We just want to see that if each of the trade between Australia and China are cutting, what's the impact in terms of economics and emission for both Australia, China, and the world. We also have for other countries, but we will not report because it's too complicated result. The methodology we use are quite straightforward. First, we use the hypothetical extraction method, which means that assume one sector trading is shut off. We completely reduce to zero, and what the impact by compare the sector before it was extracted and after it's extracted, we see the economics and the emission loss. That's actually more like considered as a value of that trade. How we estimate the impact? We use the global trading program, GTAP programs to estimate the global effect. The GTAP, because it's a computable general equilibrium, it's allowed to account for indirect benefit and loss due to the supply chain reorganized beyond the two countries. So the result actually something quite straightforward, or not big surprise that this is the first slide I will report for Australia's export to China. We have 63 sectors in the GTAP 10 database. The best year was 2015. We cut the sector individually or one by one and see the impact, compare the difference as the impact. As you will see that I know the first line, I know is Australia's top export to China. If Australia cut or shut down export, I know to China, both Australia and China will lose, and China will lose much bigger than Australia. The number here is absolute value in terms of million US dollar. You will see that the Chinese loss in the I know case is much bigger. It's more than 20 times of Australia's loss. But the key thing is that for all the export case, as long as you shut or cut off Australia export to China, both China and Australia will lose. That's very clear. And the global GDP will also lose as well. In terms of emissions, the result are quite interesting. I highlight in red because that means that if we shut down Australia export to China, the global emissions will be reduced. This is probably the only case you will see significantly reduced in the emission. In most other cases, emission will be increased or very marginal, as you see the rest lines. The reason for the reduction, even it looks good, but it's not what we want, because this is through the economic destructions. It's like exactly like what COVID-19 has caused to the emissions, because the economics will shut down. In the case of a Chinese case, the I know industry will have to shut down many Chinese steel industry and cause a lot of challenge and issue. And second on the agenda is coal. And this case, you will see that global emissions will increase 73 million tons. And then you will see the rest, the others. I think the message here is very clear and strong, is that once there is a cut of Australia export to China, both parties will lose, and globally, collectively, we all lose. Even there is a occurring case of emission decrease, but that's not in the way what we prefer because of the economic destructions. And yeah, my second result or last result is about Chinese export to Australia. And in this case, you will see that both countries will lose if China cut export to Australia. And interesting, you will see that when Australia export to China was cut, the impact in China is much bigger than Australia. When Chinese export to Australia was cut, the impact in China's GDP is much smaller than Australia. This means actually the trade is indeed organized by comparative advantage. And more important, I think, is that same like the Australia export to China, both countries and globally, we all lose. So I think some few key findings I briefly mentioned at the first one I just mentioned, and second, that the impact in Australia's export had a huge variability. The iron ore and coal are so dominant, I couldn't put in any figure. And also both countries have dominance in their exporter. So when they are the export side, they will hurt less by cut. That means the trade is organized based on the competitive advantage. And I think while China may be hurt harder than Australia in some cases, like the iron ore and coal, the relative size means that the shock to China is much smaller than Australia. So I think for middle economy and open economy like Australia, the trade, free trade is actually preferred, and then the trade sanction. And global trade will be damaged. And even though emissions impact are marginal, it's not welcome because we face huge tasks for achieve carbon neutrality in middle century. I think a few tentative policy implications. First, obviously, free trade regime actually should be upheld, and manufacture model, however, need to modify to account for extreme case, because in the past we look after efficiency, but now there is a security of supply perspective, but not necessarily to through political intervention to the supply chain. I think that should be minimized. And I think last one, now we have the COVID-19 recovery package, which may help to strengthen supply chain resilience, but such kind of strengthening should be more directed to green supply chain to account for both economics and the environmental purpose. Yeah, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shi. It's very, very interesting topic, and use the case study of Australia and China. We may have many questions to you, and also we leave the question and comments in the discussion time.